Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Visiting the Secretary of Standards for Rehabilitation on Historic Tax Credits with John Sandor. We have 1.5 HSW AIA credits available. If you would like those credits, please email Devin Miles at officemanager@heritageohio.org with your AIA member number. The learning objectives are in the chat box, so please review those first. I want to thank Sandvik Architects for being the title sponsor for the Heritage Ohio Conference. We're in day 9 of 10. I hope you've been enjoying things. I also want to thank Kuhn Restoration for being the conference sponsor. Today's session sponsor is the State Historic Preservation Office. They are both the sponsor for the AIA credits as well as today's session sponsor. Thank you very much. And Amanda Terrell is going to be introducing John. So take it away, Amanda.
Thank you, Joyce. So I am very pleased to introduce John Sandor, an architectural historian in the Technical Preservation Services Division of the National Park Service. John has been in that role since 1996, and he has been our reviewer for Ohio projects for a long time. Thanks to John's guidance and mentorship, we have this very strong historic tax credit program in Ohio today. We have a national reputation for a very well-run program. We have a great track record for getting projects to the National Park Service cleanly for approval, and that is due in large part to John and the partnership that we have developed with the National Park Service. John has always, in my experience, been willing to be part of these Heritage Ohio conferences, where he generously shares of his time and expertise so that you, building owners and applicants, can submit the best projects possible. So thank you, John, for your assistance to us and the state, and thank you for being here with us today. And with that, John, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. And thank you, Joyce, for making this forum possible. It's always a great pleasure to be participating in these programs. And I'm sorry that the participation is all remote right now, but we'll make the best of what we have. I've talked at your conference so often in the past that I think I've covered most of the topics one can imagine. So I thought maybe it makes a little sense to kind of revisit the standards themselves, to look at the language that's in them, to understand what they're really saying, and to see how that accommodates some flexibility, and then also where that flexibility ends, where there's a limit to what we can accommodate. And in the process, we're going to touch on some basic issues of storefronts, just a little bit of a review, and some issues of window replacement, a little bit of a review, and also raise the issue of color, which seems to be coming more and more to the fore as we think about it. In the past, I think we haven't thought about it much at all. So let's move forward here and see what we can learn from some of this. When we look at the standards, the language themselves, there's some particular words that I think we need to pay attention to that give us opportunities for flexibility in their application. Standard 2 says, do not alter features and spaces that characterize a property. And I emphasize the word characterize. The fact that it says characterize a property suggests that some spaces may actually not characterize a property, that they all are not subject to not being altered by Standard 2. Standard 5 talks about distinctive features, and again, that characterize a property shall be preserved. So one might intuit from that if they're not distinctive features or they do not characterize a property, maybe it's not so important to preserve them. And from Standard 6, we find the language that replacement of a distinctive feature must match. Would that mean that perhaps a feature that wasn't particularly distinctive would need less to be a match than one that was? I think those are all points that we could probably reasonably take from looking at the language and the qualifiers of the words characterize and distinctive that are put in the standards to give us that flexibility. I think that we tend to, the Park Service has put out a lot of guidance that talks about character defining features. We talk about those even in National Register nominations. We also tend to, we have written some things that sort of list features and spaces, like primary spaces, secondary spaces, but it's all sort of a black and white kind of thing. And I think that really doesn't serve the building well, or the kind of flexibility we need to make these projects work. That I prefer to think of it more as a gray scale, that we have parts of the building that are most important and parts of the building that are least important, and a big gray scale in between. And so in terms of figuring out what we can change and where we can change it, it's not an all or nothing. It's not like you save these things and you let these things go. That maybe there's some things where that which is most important you can change least, and that which is least important you can change most. And in between, there's a lot of decision making to accommodate. So let's just think about how we decide what's most important and what's least important. The hierarchies begin with ideas like orientation from the exterior of the building, the function, visibility, architectural treatment. In this building, the front faces the street. It's where the building is entered. It has enormous architectural attention paid to its detail. It's highly visible. It's corners on an alley, which we're looking down in the middle slide, where we can still see that elevation. It's not invisible. It even still has a little bit of architectural ornament. There's a bit of a cornice at the top that's simpler. And the first bay is given the same treatment as the facade of the building. So this part maybe is not a toss away, but it's also not as important as the front. There's no entry along that side. It moves down along, an alley, a secondary access point. And finally, in the last picture, we're all the way down the alley looking back to the front, and yet there's another alley going across the back, where the architectural detail of the cornice goes away altogether. There's the service entrance back there, so there's an entrance, but it's very inaccessible and very unpublic space. So perhaps that's the least important part of the building. So that same kind of logic we can apply both inside and outside as we look at these buildings and help us decide where we can accommodate change. There are two other ideas I think that are important to think about, and one is the existing integrity of space. This kitchen is in a historic building. One might wonder if it even is a historic volume. Certainly the finishes are all modern. Can this space be said to characterize the building? It probably doesn't, because it doesn't have anything to reference the historic building. You would not know you're in a historic building here. So even in a historic building, you can have spaces that their integrity is so low from changes over time that they don't really characterize the property. Also, you can have a point of deterioration where, though you might have some remnants of features and finishes that are evidence of what was there, there's too little there for it to convey any historic character anymore. You might be able to tell that there was there was plaster on the wall, but if most of the plaster is missing, then that the character of a finished space is evidenced by what's there, but it is not conveying that character with enough material left. So those are other factors in addition to the hierarchies that can affect where we go with something. So let's dive in here and look at a couple of examples of places where where change has been accepted and how we decided it was okay or not. This is a building in St. Louis. It's a block of commercial buildings with residential above, and we can see from the picture in the upper right, the facade of the building was pretty well handled in terms of having compatible storefronts reestablished and compatible windows installed. They chose not to put a cornice back that was long missing. The aerial picture from below is looking down on the roof of this building, and we can see that from the construction vehicles and dumpsters in the back, that's the rear elevation. That rear elevation is visible from a public way. That's an alley that's running along the back of the property. And we're looking across this space to the rear elevation as it has been completed at the end of this rehabilitation. So as you can see from the front, it has no architectural detail. It's a flat brick wall with punched openings. And these are changes that were deemed to be acceptable to make on an elevation that, though visible, is extremely secondary and not very important to characterizing this property. But even there, the way those changes were made was within a range of limit. There were some limits to the range of those changes. Openings were infilled with brick, but set back enough so that we didn't lose the evidence of what the openings were. The sills are still there. You can now see the outline of where openings had been that were changed. But where the openings were seemed sort of varied and not particularly meaningful to understanding the building. We have a stair going up to an entrance into the second floor of a building that wasn't there before. We have vents and grills and louvers put on this building. None of them are so large as to alter what is basically a simple rear of this building, electrical service came in here. Certainly a good place to bring it in rather than the front. But given it's the rear, was it necessary to paint it out? No, it was not. This was considered an acceptable level of change on this though visible, not particularly prominent rear elevation that had very little distinctive feature to it before the project started. The buildings on the left, I think those are from not projects, but they're also a picture taken from an alley. And we can see that there are various conditions here. I put this in only to sort of suggest that all three buildings have chimneys. If these chimneys were deteriorated enough that they couldn't be repaired, would we ask that they be rebuilt? I think not. These are buildings that though this rear is visible from a public way, the chimney is not a significant feature to this building. It's not like the chimney for the building. These buildings, most of these of this period, had multiple chimneys, many of which are gone already in some cases. It's a secondary feature that on this elevation that's no more distinctive than this would not be something that would be required to be reconstructed or rebuilt if it deteriorated enough that it needed to come down. By contrast, though, an example of where maybe something of similar nature might be more worth keeping is this group of, it's a commercial building on the corner with a group of flats aligned. It sort of looks like a bunch of row houses, except they're flats. But in the end, it was an apartment building. It wasn't just a series of independent row houses on individual lots, because the photograph in the upper right-hand corner is of the rear of the building. And what row house has a chimney that size coming out of the middle of it? What flat has a 2-unit flat has a chimney that size? And it turns out when investigating this project, there was a giant boiler in the basement of the unit, the third in from the end, that served the whole block. So clearly the chimney was important to understanding that this building was not what we expected it to be. So it was a bit of evidence about the history of this building that made it a little bit unique. And so losing this chimney altogether might be less acceptable in a situation like this, where it is a particularly unique bit of evidence that tells us something about how this building operated in the past, that the independent chimneys on a bunch of row buildings would not be the same. Now, even though the rear of buildings often can accommodate a large amount of change, there is a step too far. This building, not a project, I hope, I haven't seen it, but it's in Cincinnati. I could find pictures of it online, and somebody looks like they're doing a reasonable job on the facade, but look at the back. It's a little bit of California modern plopped down in the middle of old Cincinnati here. I don't think that even in this more secondary elevation, that something that is this completely incompatible could be considered acceptable within the standards. You still need to have some relationship to the building, and not pretend that you've just slammed the 21st century into the end of the 19th here without any sensitivity whatsoever. So I'm not saying that you can do anything you want on a secondary elevation, and the least important part of the building, but there is a point where you can go too far, and I think this pretty well exemplifies that. A lot more time and attention is spent usually trying to figure out what's okay in the middle ground. And here's an example of that, where a visible secondary elevation of a building, which was utterly plain, clearly was not meant to be thought about very much at all, given the attention paid to the facade of this building, and it was a nicely done rehabilitation of the facade. But it had fenestration. Well, they needed a little more light for the kind of use that they put in. And though they didn't add any new openings, they reopened a couple of openings, at least in part. They did extend the size of the openings on the third floor of this building. The character of this elevation is not significantly changed by that change to the longer windows on this upper level elevation. The windows are still within the width of the openings that are there. The rhythm that was established by the historic windows is still kept in place. This was given this not unimportant but not most important elevation, this was a level of change that we could find acceptable under the standards. Another example of showing both what was proposed and what ultimately was achieved was this building, where we have a kind of irregular rhythm here going on, but it again is an utterly plain, featureless brick elevation with a loading door at the end. The proposal on the left called for putting a lot of new windows in, windows that were double the size of the existing windows that were there, and including a big new glass two-story entrance. Well, that was definitely a no. Back and forth with them a little bit, realized that we have often allowed windows on elevations that have 0 windows to start with, that in this case, if we kept the bays at the beginning and the end without adding any additional windows there, that filling in the windows between all these windows with a window of similar size and just changing the detail. Instead of putting in a jack arch or a segmental arch on these, they just get a lintel. So though quite a few windows were added, nearly as many were added as existed, was considered to be an acceptable amount of change for an elevation of this importance, even though it was visible from the front of the building. Another one that was a step too far was this building where very few windows on the side elevation. We could have accepted quite a few windows, I think, without changing the character of the building too much. But they went ahead and did the project, and not only did they add a lot of windows, they punched big holes in the building and turning a solid into a bunch of voids. This one, I think, a project came in and was denied. I think it even went to an appeal and was upheld on the appeal. So it's not an all or nothing. There's a lot of in between here, and finding that level of in between is what takes everybody's good judgment on our part and with the help of the state office to make those decisions. It's why we're not doing a check form here, but requiring people to analyze it and think about it. A lot of buildings have a lot of deterioration, and trying to decide what we need to know to evaluate that and how we should be evaluating that, I think, is something that merits a little bit of discussion. Most of the structural elements of a building, unless it's a warehouse or kind of very functional building, are either in areas such as the attic or the basement, which are really secondary spaces that we probably don't are not required to be maintained in terms of their existing character. They are at the bottom of the spectrum in terms of that hierarchy of important to least important, and therefore can be changed the most. And then if the structural elements aren't exposed in those areas, and most of the rest of the building, except for the warehouse kind of building or industrial building, they are covered by finishes. So if somebody wants to replace these rafters, what should I really be wanting to know? Well, I would be wanting to know, like, what is the surface that it supports that might be historic, that might matter, might be something that we could see from some place that would matter. In this case, if it's the rafters, is there a historic roof material up there that we would care about? And are replacing the rafters going to disturb that? If not, nobody's going to ask to replace a rafter they don't need to replace. I don't see why it matters if they're replacing, if the documentation is any better than this, because who is going to replace rafters because they need to bump up their QREs? I mean, this just doesn't happen. It's not significant historic material if they're not gutting the building down to a shell. And that's the distinction. We'll talk about that in a minute. As long as we still have a building, if somebody wants to replace these with no more documentation than this, I don't think here at the Park Service we would have a problem with that. We'd want to know, are we disturbing a surface that would matter, that was historic in the process of doing so? As with the floor on the picture on the right, clearly somebody needed to replace this floor. They wouldn't have gone to this much trouble. You're not going to do this sort of thing because it's it's a fun job to do, or that you need to expend more money. Instead of worrying about how much, the thing to be worried about is what was the floor that was on there. Was there a floor that was historic in character? And can it, if it was beyond repair, are we going to get it restored? Not whether we're replacing 20 or 60% of the floor joists. That shouldn't be the issue if the floor joists are only visible from the basement. Now, the joists in the ceiling, if they were visible, that becomes a bit more of an issue because if they were contributing to the character of the space. But in the case of this space, we can see from the paint lines that there was probably a ceiling in this space. And I don't have the specifics of the project in particular. But when we're replacing these kind of structural elements, these are not things that are easy to do They're generally, nobody's going to do them if they don't need to. They are necessary to make the building sound, and we're not going to tell somebody, well, you can't use this corner of the building anymore because you've met your quota for floor joist replacement. I think that these are not places we need that we're going to spend a lot of time scrutinizing that. It's another matter if somebody wants to replace the windows. Those are things that people tend to replace unnecessarily, and there's a good reason to spend a little more energy looking at those. The caveat about the replacement, though, comes to when you don't have much left, and particularly in the building on the right. These were some shotgun houses in the south. They were part of a project, and I had a similar project in a minority neighborhood of cultural importance in Kansas City, where there were frame buildings, and the condition was so poor. We were counting boards as to what could actually be saved. So we would be concerned about the studs if that's all that you can keep here. And would that be enough? It might not be. So when we're down to very, very little bit of material, then every bit of material starts to count. We don't want to come onto a job site. We don't require in-progress photos, so we don't have the opportunity sometimes to know what the worst-case scenario is in the process. But you would not want to look at the job site in the middle of the project and find that you're looking at the foundation and nothing else. That's a reconstruction. That's not a rehabilitation. So there is a minimum amount of material that needs to be maintained. And in the case where you have these fragile wood buildings, that can often be a problem. In the Baltimore row house on the right, if there was enough of the material here left to call this a certified building at the part one, then if this is what is left, I don't think we would be sweating it over whether somebody decided to replace the rest of those floor joists at the front of the building because they weren't adequately stout enough or whatever, because ultimately they're not going to be seen. So when the floor goes down and the ceiling goes up, if the joists that are underneath all that are historic or not historic is really not going to be significant to the character of this building. Ultimately, it's getting the finishes that are going to cover them up is really what's going to matter, assuming that they're not proposing to leave it exposed, which in this type of a project, that usually is not the case. But this is a building that, because it's a brick building and it had a roof on it, has a floor on the first floor, the loss of a few more floor joists is not going to make the difference between a project and a failure. Masonry pointing is another thing where the quantity probably is less important than the quality. In the end, masonry pointing is expensive to do. Nobody's going to get up there and like say, oh, I'm having such a good time, let me spend another week doing this. Like the owner is going to say, what? Like I can't afford this. So when you have to repoint a building, in the end, we in our own publications talk about mortar having a lifespan, that ultimately it's not meant to last forever, at least from these earlier buildings. So if a building like this one, which had been sandblasted and had a lot of missing mortar and a lot of hard mortar, if they wanted to repoint the whole thing, it really wasn't an issue. It wouldn't have been an issue. It wasn't a project, but it looks quite different because the mortar that was there wasn't very good. It wasn't the right mortar to start with, and much of it, and a lot of it was quite eroded, and the whole brick was eroded. So it was clear it didn't have colored mortar. So some of the amount of the prominence in the mortar is due to the fact that it more fully filled the joints than it had been for a long time. But at this point, I think the energy we would want to spend is on a good sample before the work is started, and ultimately that good documentation to confirm that the work was done appropriately. But there's not going to be a threshold where we're going to say, well, 60% is too much. You can't do that much. You can only do 40%. It's again the kind of thing where somebody's not likely to be doing unnecessary repointing work unless they have a mason who's managed to fool the owner into thinking that he needs work he doesn't need in order that he has a bigger paycheck. So let's focus a little bit on providing us with the information that we need to make the kind of decision that what matters in the decision process, and that's about the method of doing some of this stuff and how it's going to turn out, rather than the quantity of how much was being done, because that's not going to make or break the project. There's not a point where we're going to say you can't repoint this much of the building if it needs to be repointed. back to the standards for another bit of language that I think always sort of perplexed me, and I'd like to sort of give at least my interpretation of it. We're talking in Standard 6, it talks about replacing of missing or non-historic features by saying that replacement of missing features shall be substantiated by various kinds of evidence, pictorial and physical. The word substantiated, if you look at the definition, it really amounts to more like saying justified, not informed. You know, it's a little more restrictive of word. So I would take it from that, and that is how we have taken it here usually, is that if you have a missing feature that it really isn't essential to the building, like the tower on this school, if you did not have real evidence to put that, if you just knew there was a tower there, but you didn't have a good enough photograph to base it on, then there's no reason to do that. There's no justification for putting that tower back. You really have to have to substantiate the reconstruction of that tower with decent evidence. But using the word substantiated, well, what if the storefront's missing? Well, are we going to say if you don't have enough evidence, you can't put the storefront back? No. For a missing window, a missing roof, a missing storefront, you need to put something in for the building to survive, the building to be used. So I think the substantiated part probably is less applicable to those kind of features that absolutely must go back and don't have to be justified to go back. And we turn to Standard 9 that says the new work shall be compatible. It's nice if you can find evidence of something, but you may not. It is not. No one's going to hold your. We don't know unless and most of us do not have the time as the reviewers to go see if there is evidence. So you're under no obligation to tell us that, you know, oh, I found this photograph. If it shows something you really don't want to do, and even if you do find the photograph, if it's missing, you are not obligated to replicate what is in the photograph. You only must put in something that is compatible for the feature that is essential. So you might find some really quirky window that your building had, but if I look at your building and based on the architecture, I can say that the window would be X, Y, or Z based on this building alone, then that's going to be enough to get you over the hump. You do not have to put in the quirky window. Now, if you want to put in a quirky window, you're going to need to have that photograph, because we're going to go to the neutral generic solution, something that is essentially straightforward and compatible when we're replacing a feature that's missing. So I think to kind of clarify where it's nice to have the information, but you're not always obliged to follow it, especially if the building itself does not dictate that from the physical structure of what's left of the building. Now to just touch on some basic points of storefronts as a review, because I've talked about that several times. And I love looking at these at the historic images, and I think that it really kind of reminds us that what we think of as the generic solution for a storefront is not as universal as we might like it to be, but it is a good starting point. And one of the big things for that we see as mistakes over and over again is people forget that the framing, whatever material you're putting in that storefront, should be sized based on what it does. If it only holds the glass, it can be a very small dimension. It has these little tiny dowels almost for these shop front windows and this little building here on this neighborhood storefront. On the other hand, if it has to hold up the building, it has to be beefier. It's going to be more substantial. And usually that's going to be something that survives. Otherwise, the building wouldn't survive. So the cast iron elements, in the end, they're not very, very wide, but they are rather deep. And the beam that crosses that storefront wasn't adequate to be held up without the assistance of the cast iron piers. A lot of times the beam that goes across there is self-supporting from the ends, and it does not need intermediate support. So there's no reason to be putting vertical elements in your storefront that look like they're holding up the wall when they do not need to. Sometimes, though, you end up with something that doesn't quite jive with the building because of changes over time. This building, with this 20th century storefront, they wanted to change it. They had a historic image where it had clearly a 3-bay display windows and entrance at the front at one time, but that drawing was taken before the 4th floor was added to the building. So we don't know how long that configuration survived and at what point the 4th floor went on. So we wouldn't want to create false history. But in the end, they couldn't go back to that anyhow, because if you look carefully at the bride's house storefront on the left, you can see that there is a pier in the shadow behind the glass, which runs across in front of it, that's holding up the middle of the building. So whatever span we have in terms of the distance across this opening is divided in two, with a pier and there's actually a wall on the inside that runs behind this pier that's holding up the middle of the building. So going back to this historic image is of no value. We have to find something that works with the physical, because nobody's going to ask you to change the structure of the building in order to do this. What works with the existing structure? Now, had we had no evidence, we probably could have come up with something. But in the end, the picture on the far right shows that when they started to take the marble off, they found some terracotta that was in place at the time, at least within part of the time that the building was divided into two instead of three at the ground floor. So that there was enough of that material left in place that was historic to save, and it became the model for designing the new storefront. So we had layers of material of stuff here, and a lot of times we won't even have that. We'll have nothing except we have a post in the middle, and we have to design a storefront for a building that existed long before that configuration did at the storefront. So it can be a bit of a challenge, and you always have to work from what you have to start with. We generally say that a compatible storefront for most like 19th, early 20th century buildings is going to consist of a base panel, a display window, and a transom. And indeed, transoms were very common from sometime, in mid to late 19th century. We began to see them, but they were not universal. And it's not necessary to have a transom to have a compatible storefront. A lot of storefronts, even as late as the turn of the century, had windows with muntins. They were big windows without a transom, but they were divided with a simple muntin. Some even into the turn of the century and into the early decades of the 20th had no transom. They just had large pieces of glass, as the two examples on the right did. Now, this is sort of an irrelevant bit of information, I think, for most projects, because nobody wants to use a bigger piece of glass. They're happy that they can most of you are going to be happy that you can put a transom, because it makes your display window smaller, and the display window is the expensive part because it probably has to be tempered, which adds additional cost. And if it's insulated, so I throw this out just for sort of amusing information that the transom was not a universal feature, but I can see why nobody's going to want to go there, because you want to get that display window down to a more cost-effective size. So just a bit of information. But there's also no rule of proportion of alignment or alignment of the transom sash. We have transoms, if we look at historic images, from the very narrow ones, like the little vents in the photo on the left, to very deep ones, like the photograph in the middle, where the transom is almost the height of the display window, to ones on as in the building on the right, a 20th century configuration in a slightly earlier building, but a historic storefront. That the transoms don't line up with what's going on underneath. It's a fairly deep transom. Again, it's 2/5 of the height of the building. The display window is 3/5. So there's no magic number that it has to be some 1/4 of the height of the display window. If we look through historic images over time, we will find that they really ran the gamut. But one of the things that can help us decide where to put the transom is going to be based on how high is the opening. Because in the end, the taller the opening, the taller everything needs to be. The other thing is that we usually can find is that the transom bar usually was related to the height of the doors. And the doors rarely were just little, domestic sized 80-inch doors. The doors were more often than not taller doors, often an 8-foot door. And so if that helps to define your transom line, that's a good point to start to decide how big the transom needs to be. But if your transom bar at 8 feet still gives you a 6-foot high transom, then that's probably okay. It means you have a very high ceiling. And trying to compress things to get some magical proportion is really not appropriate if we look at the historic evidence. That's not where things necessarily were. The building on the right here is one where it illustrates a couple of points very well. One, those doors probably could have been a little taller to meet the transom bar, or do we know, or why was the transom bar there? Why wasn't it a little lower to meet the top of the doors? If there was no hook or or evidence on those cast iron piers that are there to decide where that transom is. Why put it where, we end up with this extra little glass above the door? I wouldn't say that never happened historically, but it was less likely to happen. Generally, the height of the door bumped up to an appropriate height was a determinant of the height of where the transom bar was placed. The good thing here is that we can see that the framing for all this is fairly modest. It's very minimal. Though the cast iron really and the beam should have been painted, I mean, we can sort of see what's happening structurally, and that's what's happening in most of these storefronts, even if we can't see it as the projects are finished, that it ends up have a signboard or has, at least the stuff is painted, which this one really should have been. But it does suggest that maybe we need to think a little more broadly about how we design some of these storefronts and still accomplish what you need to do. And the biggest beef of all is that the divisions in the display windows need to be fewer in most cases. I understand that we don't want to spend a fortune getting a giant piece of glass, and we are using tempered glass today, whereas these old windows that sometimes had windows that were more than 12 feet wide and 10 feet tall pieces of glass that were polished plate glass, probably imported from France. Nobody's going to do that. We're not asking you to do that. We can be reasonable about what is the size of the glass, but let's not divide it more than is really necessary. These are smaller than a patio door replacement glass, and this building doesn't have much to hold it up, and we have these bulky wood mullions between the units of glass as though it's holding up half the building. This is the worst this is something we should never see, but there's a lot of improvement even within what we do see to try to reduce the framing of the glass and get as big a piece of glass as you can reasonably afford to do within the budget for your project. And if it doesn't line up with the transom, so be it. The divisions in the transom sash were not necessarily coincidental. Often the transom accommodated ventilation, and there were actual sashes that operated, as we can see from some of those earlier photographs, not always, but sometimes. So they wouldn't necessarily have the divisions that were going to hit just on wherever the glass itself had to be divided. And sometimes it's better to make the glass division, if we have to have a division where there might not have been one historically, to make it as minimal as possible. They, butt glaze it with a backup piece and just a thin cap over it, and not try to bulk it up beyond what is absolutely minimally necessary. Well, let's leave the storefronts and go back to questions on the interior of a building and where flexibility might be there and where we might sometimes misunderstand what the standards expect of us to do. Sometimes there is evidence of a historic feature. I mentioned that a little bit when talking about deterioration at the beginning. In the case of the building on the left, it's clear there was a corridor here. The tile is unmistakable for what it defined, and a little bit of evidence on the ceiling. But there is not a corridor here now. So to require that corridor to be reestablished, it's not there to preserve. That would be requiring restoration, which is not the intent of this program. As Mary Angela reminded us, it's a rehabilitation program. So reestablishing this corridor would be acceptable, but definitely not required in the case of this project on the left. The project on the right, it's hard to know. Did the corridor continue down? It looks like it might have, beyond where it seems to end in the mid-ground of the upper picture. Would you need to extend it? No. But the part that is there, which we can see very plainly in the bottom right photograph, would need to be preserved, at least in part and probably in whole, given how little was there. It does survive enough to convey historic character, and it would not be a restoration to ask that corridor to be kept. So it depends on what you have, but evidence of something is not reason to require it to be reestablished. It can be useful to an owner who might want to do something that would not otherwise seem logical based on the building without that evidence, but it is not the basis that we can insist upon recreating things. Standard 6 talks about repair. If you have missing plaster as in the wall on the left, reestablishing that plaster is in the realm of repair. If it's necessary to take the plaster off and use drywall because you can't afford a plaster, that's probably acceptable, as long as the relationship with the trim is the same. But you can't just leave it as it is. That's damaged, that's deteriorated. It's not a missing element. It is a piece of a missing piece of an element or of a feature, not a missing feature. I guess that's the difference. It's a missing aspect of it, but not the whole feature. Missing the wall is still a plastered wall. In comparison, the chimney breast on the picture on the right, which is in the same room, it's not deterioration. That plaster was taken off long ago intentionally. If it wasn't taken off as just to facilitate getting by with it to start this project, then that can be left alone. That's a full piece in and of itself. There's no remnant of plaster there. It could be left as it's found, and restore. And to ask them to put plaster back there would be requiring restoration. May they put plaster back? Of course, because it's not important. It's not the historic condition of the wall, but it's something that can be left if what is left is a full piece. It's not a remnant in terms of the way the gap is in the plaster on the picture on the left. A lot of times we lose the plaster to drywall altogether in the process of furring out the walls. And though we might incentivize skipping the furring by allowing some more flexibility in the window installation where there is historic trim that can be saved and the wall can be kept with its plaster, I think we're going to see more and more furring over time. The energy people are definitely making a little more noise, and probably rightly so. The fact that these buildings are historic doesn't mean they should get a complete pass in terms of trying to be a little more efficient, given the climate change issues we may be facing right now. So, to that end, we have to find how much change we can accommodate with this furring, and to my mind, it's terribly unfortunate that we lose the plaster beneath this all. If it gives the building more viability in the long term in terms of its energy consumption, then that's a reasonable thing to do. The two illustrations on the left are where the amount of increase in the thickness of the wall is quite substantial, and it really changes the character of the room that these openings are in. It makes you feel like you're in a 10-story building with load-bearing masonry walls on the first floor. It doesn't make a lot of sense. The picture on the left on the top is the before condition. There was some reveal to those windows. And the bottom picture shows it as completed. The trim was removed and reinstalled, and the wall was furred out modestly. Generally, I think sometimes we vary a little bit depending on who's saying it, but I thought our goal in the office was at about 3 to 3.5 inches of furring. Maybe a little bit more if you have a very large openings and the wall. And the effect on the larger the opening, increase in depth will be less of an impact. Like if you're at a school with a whole bank of windows, maybe the wall could be a little bit thicker. But then, of course, if you have a whole bank of windows, how important is it to fur the wall because it's mostly glass instead of wall anyhow? But it's another question. So if we can fur them out minimally, that can be acceptable. And in the case of these windows here, it's probably within the 3.5-inch range, including the finish. Sometimes if the plaster is missing on the wall, that gives you a little more space relative to where the historic finish was. And I think we really want to try to, as people need to be more efficient, then the spray foam is definitely going to be the way to go with these sort of things. It not only gives it more energy efficiency within a given inch of insulation, it also provides a means to keep moisture from getting back to the now colder wall surface behind the insulation, which with fiberglass bats, cannot be guaranteed, especially if there are any electrical receptacles put in a wall, as typically would be the case for most any wall. So, and if the wall is a wall that has no windows, then it really doesn't matter how much you fur it, because there's no relationship to maintain. If it gets 5 inches, who's going to know? You've lost 5 inches of floor space, but at that point, it's only about where the windows are, because it's the impact on the window of the thickening out that matters. So I think I talked a little last year about energy and furring and some of the insulation issues. So I won't go back into that today. But I think we're probably going to see this trend even come down the pike even more as we have more and more places are energy codes where it's not a choice. no matter what is used for how the building is used. So it basically means they can't use our program at all. It's not even a standard 1 question in some cases. If we have something like a chimney breast where one might have expected, well, there's a chimney behind that, why is there an offset? But if there's a chimney, where's the hearth? Or where, was there a fireplace? Was this a building built in a period when maybe they used a heating stove and didn't have a hearth? If this is all that's left, if there's baseboard put over it, it's clearly not a recent change. Saving that offset is not critical if in the process of furring the wall, that distinction of that few-inch projection goes away, or you're putting cabinets in front of it because it's in a room that's going to become a kitchen. I think we can say that this is not a distinctive, important feature to the character of this room. If it had a fireplace in it, a firebox still, a hearth on the floor, these are things that might add to meaning to it. But when it's just a bump in the wall, it is not a feature that I would say we could call a character-defining feature, or one that needs to be sustained in the process of the rehabilitation. There may be little reason to change it, and that's fine, but I don't think we have to go to the mat to keep something like this. Now let's talk about color a little bit before I run completely out of time here. I think we have, I wish we had a little more guidance for you about this, and I'm raising this to just sort of start the conversation. Unfortunately, I think where we are with color is a little bit, we've left it to the way the court once left the idea of pornography. You'll know it when you see it. Like, we ask for the color chips. Like, we don't give you guidance to say, well, it can't be this or it should be that. And like, if it looks okay, then it's okay. And if not, it's not. So, but let's stop and think about if we could provide some guardrails, like where we might tip the balance too far with the color of choice. We usually have said in the past that it's just paint, right? So it's very temporal, it's going to be changed, but more and more we're using things like clad windows and other materials that aren't painted. The finish is baked in, and they're not going to change until the element is changed. So it merits thinking a little more about. The color should not fight the architecture. If the architecture is something that is connected integrally to a certain range of color, then maybe we need to think about that in terms of how we paint these buildings. A Greek Revival building, like the one in the middle, the whole concept was based around the building being white. Now, if this building was had a long period of significance in a historic district, and over the course of the time somebody painted it dark brown, and that's in the period of significance, and somebody wants to go back and paint it a color that's within the period, maybe that's acceptable. But otherwise, unless we have that specific evidence that it was the oddball that was painted blue, a Greek Revival building needs to be white or close to white. Maybe it could be cream, maybe it could be pale gray, but it's a light color. The whole point of the architecture was based upon our image of the past, and the light color is critical. An Italianate building is just the opposite. The last thing you'd want to see is an Italianate building painted white. Though I suspect there are parts of the Midwest, and certainly when I grew up, like almost every house in my neighborhood was painted white. I don't remember any buildings. Maybe a shingle building was painted dark brown, but it was sort of the standard in the early 20th century or mid 20th century. I'm not that old. But if we knew a building was painted white within the period of significance, maybe it's okay to continue to paint it white. But like I mentioned earlier, nobody wants to paint anything white these days. We're lucky if we can get somebody to keep something white, much less to paint it white in the first place. So I think that becomes less of a problem with these later buildings, that we're not having a clamor of white where it doesn't belong. But that may change, because in the end it's all fashion, and that's how we've gotten to the variety we have. When we have these streetscapes of Italianate buildings like we have in Over the Rhine, where we have a range of colors, we're not even sure when the buildings were painted in most cases, and most of them have reasonable color schemes where they're not bright orange and they're not black, and they have the reasonable amount of contrast between the trim elements and the windows and the masonry without being too flashy. And in this case, I think we probably would want to. Do we need to see the paint chip? Well, maybe we do. That's an easier way. But I think we could say up front, even if before we see the paint chip, that we want some sort of medium tone. These buildings shouldn't be white. They probably shouldn't be black either. So in between, there's a lot of leeway, and it probably shouldn't be a super primary color. This period colors were complex colors. So as long as we have some basic framework, then there's a lot of room for the applicant and the owner to choose colors that meet their taste without fighting the building. I have never seen a building that I could verify was historically painted black. So I think we could probably just say that without evidence, we don't need to see any black buildings, unless the owner can prove with some paint evidence that their building was entirely black. We had a building once in Wisconsin. Somebody wanted to paint black, and I think we said no. But by the same token, I don't think there's much evidence in history of buildings being painted these kind of super intense colors used, much less on a Queen Anne house where colors were complicated, probably never white, at least not in the period that they were built, and certainly not white mixed with the day glow paints that were put on this. So I think there probably are some limits to where even paint can go too far. So trying to find craft language instead of paint chips may be a little difficult, but I don't think it's impossible that you don't have to actually have the specific paint from the start chosen, but give us some idea of the kind of relationships. I think a lot of times I see people wanting to make the building a little more complicated, a little more interesting. And looking at these historic photographs of storefronts, we can see where they did kind of create that elaboration. We can see that like the panels and the cast iron piers of this building on the left are painted a slightly different hue, or at least a different value. A lot of times the color wouldn't be radically different in hue, it'd just be a little different in value. It might be a darker or a lighter, the same things. Again, here, panel moldings picked out. The panel itself is a darker color. Over here, again, the architectural details that existed were picked out, but minimally. Like they didn't choose to pick out the panel and the panel molding like in 3 colors, or they didn't paint, the molding one color and the panel another color. It didn't go overboard. A little bit of subtlety is a good rule of thumb for these. Let's not overdo it unless you have a painter you're trying to support. And sometimes paint is just really ridiculous. This is a department store in downtown Washington that was painted dark green. It's the earliest part of the department store when they built a new addition to it in the early 20th century. The ground floor was white marble, and I was really surprised when I looked at the historic photographs that they didn't paint this dark green base of cast iron white to blend with its addition, but they did not. It remained dark green until it was finished as a tax project, and years later, afterwards, the owner decided that he sort of fancied a more carnivalesque approach and spent a lot of money painting all this ornament out in a way that would never have been done. This would not have been, I think, an appropriate treatment when the project was coming through the tax program. So let's try to contain ourselves a little bit here with not go wild with the color. Here's an example of where color, even a kind of a minor level, can matter. This building was white. All the paint on the building was white except for the shutters. Nothing else was painted. Had they wanted to paint it cream, which they did, that would have been acceptable. Had they wanted the crown molding to come off and the K gutter to be installed because the cost of relining the box gutters was too much, well, it's not a good choice, but it might have minimally met the standards if the gutter had at least been the same color as the rest of the building. But instead, we have this dark bronze line outlining the edge of the roof in every place on a gutter that was in the end supposed to be repaired, not replaced. So you can see here, the K gutter is not completely irrelevant to the shape of the crown molding, though it's certainly quite deeper. But the last thing you want to do is call attention to it by making it a dark brown color. This project was determined with the treatment it currently has not to meet the standards until they can see what remediation they can make. So it's not that color in absolute terms, it's relationship of parts. You don't want to make one part stand out from the others if it historically wasn't the case. I think it's also a bit of a problem that the windows went from being all white to being, let's see if we can go back one, to being dark brown as well, but there's enough of the cream colored frame around them that it almost just looks like the sash is dark. And even in this period of time, sometimes the sash alone would be painted the darker color. So though it wasn't the historic condition, having a dark sash would not necessarily be a completely incompatible solution, though it certainly does change it from when it was all white, and that was how it had always been. Downspouts tended to be painted because they were metal that would rust in the day, and often paint on a utilitarian building would be tinner's red, which is kind of the paint used for all metal at the time. And you can see when the wall itself was painted, as in the photo on the left, the paint, whatever was being put on the wall, just painted over the downspout at the same time. It was less a conscious decision than just a practical one, because the color of the downspout changes as it goes up, and the top, I think, was probably more rusted than painted. This very high style building has a downspout that running down here between the two buildings is a downspout for the building on the left, and it's not the color of the stucco, it's the color of the trim. So somebody chose not to paint it out, but rather to paint it light, because it's clearly not tinner's red either. The building on the right, the larger, fancier building next to it, is such a high-style building, I suspect that its downspouts are internal. And should this building had been unable to where a project there was unable to keep the internal gutters and had to have an exterior gutter for some reason, this is a building where you'd absolutely need to paint it out, because it's so formal a building that any intrusive element like that shouldn't be, we don't want to notice it. So if it's something that would never have been there, then there's more reason to paint it out. Just in contrast, the house we looked at there for the Colonial Revival, we can see that the gutter on this house was white. It was always white. They use no paint but white paint. So even though it was a red brick house, they made no effort to paint the gutter out. They just acknowledged it for what it was and left it be. And most of these buildings, even these early 19th century buildings, had gutters and downspouts. So the downspout, if the downspout was painted, it probably was more accidental. Just as I mentioned, like the gutter, a downspout on that very formal Italianate palazzo, if we have electrical service entrances, which on many of these cities, that's where it comes in, and you don't have a choice. And the electric companies are notoriously unnegotiable about these things. And as we use more and more electricity, these elements get even bigger. So in this case, if we have to have something like this on the front of the building, it probably should be painted to blend as much as possible with the back, because it's a very non-historic, even an exceedingly intrusive feature, the way it has to be done. If this was on the back of the building, it might not matter so much. Color can be useful at minimizing things we don't need. This building, you can see these light fixtures here on the left from a decade or so ago. They lit up the building, completely unnecessary architectural lighting to flood the wall with light at nighttime, and then a downlight to make the street a little safer. They were really awful, and they were big black boxes. I noticed when I was by there recently, they've been replaced by these little spider leg light fixtures that now are painted the color of the brick. They're still kind of unnecessary to the extent they are uplights. To the extent that they're lighting the sidewalk in a way that's necessary, maybe they're a little more justified. And they certainly are a lot better, because the technology now has made all this kind of lighting a whole lot less intrusive from the start. It's okay to say no, and I would suggest that some of the projects you may need to forego this kind of architectural lighting if you can't get it to the point where it's not really visible, because it's not something necessary for the functional reuse of this building. It's a ego thing to flood your building with light. It's not something that is necessary, and the rehabilitation program is more likely to accommodate the change that's necessary to get the new use. If you have basic light fixtures, something that are just minimally functional kind of things and with no extra flourish to them, there's little need for us to be too concerned about that sort of thing, especially on a building of this scale. A few simple, straightforward light fixtures is nothing to worry about, and they can be just what they are. There's no reason to have to fuss with them over. And they're usually not, they're not trying to flood the building with light. We're simply getting a little light on the ground where there may not be street lights enough in the neighborhood. Buildings that are really architecturally conceived need to be thoughtful about the color when color is being changed, especially on a window that's probably going to be a clad window. It's going to be that color for a while. These windows are white in the St. Louis School, designed by William Ittner, who was a fabulous school architect that did really extraordinary buildings. The owner wanted to make them black in the replacement. We said no. Like, what evidence do you have that he ever used any dark window? Well, we found a picture from an architectural publication where it looks like the windows were kind of a medium tone in another building, a similar building in a similar area of the time, but they weren't black. So we still said no to black, and he ended up digging around enough in the building on the window that was covered over by an addition to suggest that the windows may have been a light green. That's a copper, patina copper on the gable, so it made a lot of sense for that color to be used for the windows. And so we have still a light colored window. We don't know for sure that I'm not sure if these windows were even the original windows, but it was light enough that even if the windows were white, we're still, the value of the window relative to the contrast with the brick will be a little bit more, a little closer to what it is now than it would be if we were to paint the windows black. And black does seem to be what everybody wants. Here's a building from 1859. We can see every window that we can see looks like it's white or nearly so. It was the fashion of the time. Most of these buildings in historic districts have a long period of significance. And if we took that same picture in 1879, we probably would have seen windows of a different color, even on the same buildings. Here is this 1896 street elevation in New York. And you can see, even though the buildings are different tones from light to dark and some natural materials, I'm not sure the center one looks like it's probably a painted stucco or something. But the others are stone. That the windows are darker, or they're at least a medium shade. They're not white anymore. So, like I said, I don't think anybody's going to be clamoring to paint their windows white, but we'll see. If you really have your heart set on a black window, well, let's look at history and what actually got painted a dark color. And here's a photo from Cincinnati itself, where both the building on the left and the two little buildings on the right, the window frames, the vertical jambs, the mullions, the transom bars are a light color, and the sash is black. Something was done in colonial times. We can see here from this turn of the century picture where we have light frames and a dark sash. Clad window manufacturers can give you, in many cases, make the sash different than the rest of the window. You shouldn't be picking out the brick mold, though. I mean, that was a distinction, picking out of an element that wouldn't be picked out as a separate color. If you're going to pick something out and it is different and darker, it probably should be the sash and not some other piece of the window if it wasn't a particularly ornamental piece. Here was a building where the color was a proposal for color here was going to fight the architecture or create an architectural concept the building didn't have. The building is not a stack of pancakes. It's a single wall with punched openings. The proposal was to paint each floor a different color. They wanted it to be an identity for the residents so that each floor could be understood as like, I live on the pink floor or I live on the green floor. And that was a clear no, and the project went forward without the painting. We've had a few other examples of other projects in other places where people want to paint stripes or create sort of architectural distinction where none exists. And the answer to that is always no. So I'm just about out of time, and let me talk just a little bit about windows, kind of talk about the range. There's replacement and then there's replacement. And it kind of moves in stages. As these four windows illustrate. We can have new sash, where you can either modify the operation or disable it altogether, but just leave everything else the same. Or you can add new sash in a track alone. So the window can operate with a new system for balancing. You can have an insert unit, which is a full frame, but designed in a way to fit in behind the blind stop of the window. And there are positive and negatives to that. We'll look at that. And finally, always the best choice if you really need to replace the window is to go back to the rough opening, because you can much more likely get a good match for the historic window if you have to do more than just replace the sash. So the insert is the least among these choices. When you can just do the sash, that's a pretty unobtrusive way to deal with the window replacement and repair. If you're doing a new sash, you really need to have jambs that are sound in parallel, though they can, if they're out of square, you can still fix that as long as you choose a wood window. And though that's a sash pack on the left, you can see if the window's out of square, if they just ordered that window a quarter of an inch longer, pulled the weather stripping and planed it a little bit and reinstalled the weather stripping, they could have had a very tight fit. But if you have a gap of 3/8 of an inch at one side to 0 at the other, weather stripping is not designed to accommodate that level of change. If you use a new sash, you can even get in a sash that might have insulated glass in it. But if you're not, if you're going to continue to use the weights, the counterbalances, you'll have a bit of a challenge to get enough weight in those weight pockets to make them sound. And for this situation, you do need a sill that's not so bad that you can at least replace that. And this, like, if you're replacing only the sash, there's no reason for anyone to question this kind of a situation. I mean, this is an easy solution and a very pro-preservation solution if the sash alone are the problem, and it can get you insulated glass in many cases. The next step up would be to use a track so that you can get rid of that weight box or that weight and pulley, which is often a source for leaking air. You still need to have a pretty good sill or one that you can repair with some epoxy. The sash can at this point be clad or it can be wood. It can be insulated glass. Now, if it's clad, you're not going to be able to adjust it if the opening's out square. The track color may be a problem if you want dark windows, but in the case of like the black window, if they'd have just painted the whole frame a lighter color and just the sash black, it would have been, who would have noticed the frame? And in the green window on the right, the frame is, or the sash, the color of the track is less of an issue where there's not so much contrast. The advantage to this is that you don't have to touch the inside. The plaster doesn't get disrupted. The trim can remain in place. And an added benefit, which is often a driving factor for some projects in terms of replacement of the window, is the need to abate lead. In this case, all your friction surfaces are now new material. It's either the track or the new sash. So we're not having lead. We don't need to strip lead off of things that are rubbing against each other, and maybe the rest of the lead, depending on the authority you're operating under, would allow you to encapsulate that. Maybe the sash needs to be stripped, but it diminishes lead risk. I'll just put it that way. So it's a positive aspect of this, that even if you can't get rid of the whole window, you're going to make the window a little bit safer by not having lead surfaces rubbing against each other. And we certainly would encourage this as a solution for a lot of projects. And the visible track was what every new window had in 1980. I mean, that's just what the industry gave us. Now we have concealed tracks that do much better. The insert unit starts to create a bit of a problem. If your opening's out of square, then you don't have to do any carpentry. The window on the right, which is I think from Ohio project, you can see how the angle of the sill, but we put a square unit in, and what do we do with the gap? We just caulked it. And even the worst carpenter knows how to use a caulking gun, even if a plane or a chisel would befuddle them. These windows can be wood, they can be clad wood, they can be composite, sometimes even fiberglass. They have the advantage of leaving the interior trim in place and no disruption on the inside. And if you have trim that is of some value, this may be a worthy compromise. And I've considered this to be meeting the standards on projects where, in exchange for using this window, type of a window, we get trim retained in place on the inside. It does increase the size and the complexity of the frame. It increases the size of the frame or reduces the size of the glass, and makes a more complex profile because we have an extra element. We have the historic blind stop, and then we have a new blind stop for the window. So sometimes the frames of the sash are a little bit narrower, so that then the glass isn't as big. So the total volume of mass there for the window is a little smaller. These need to be looked at very carefully and chosen carefully, and certainly installed without much, with great care, so as not to diminish the size of the opening or change its appearance. If you look at the manufacturer's details, they would have you think that they install it like in a drawing, which pushes it way far forward of where it needs to be. The blind stop should be the front of the sash. Both of these solutions wouldn't look so bad if they'd pushed the window back a little in the opening, or you wouldn't see that shadow line around the edge. The white one on the right, you need to fill it with caulk, but you can see the casing or the brick mold and the blind stop are still in place, and then the window is fit within that, and then the extra blind stop is kind of minimized on these particular models. Sometimes the blind stop gets cut off, and we use just really a new clad window snugged up tight to the brick mold or the casing. But again, in the one on the casing on the right, it would have helped if the casing and the window were the same color, and if the gap had been caulked so that it created a flush surface. just different ways of achieving the same thing. Here's a picture of a historic window on the left and a couple that look like they probably were installed as inserts, so it's not clear. Certainly the middle one was, because we have two blind stops here and then a really skinny sash. So the total width of the frame here is not a whole lot greater, but we've exchanged the parts. We have now, altered the proportions of the different pieces. Is that okay? I mean, these kind of things are always okay on a secondary elevation. I would go so far as to say that where our guidance already says that the match on a secondary elevation doesn't need to be as good as standard 6 sort of implies is the case. If it's not the most character defining piece, maybe the match is not as important. It needs to be compatible, but it may not need to be perfect. So using these kind of window solutions on secondary elevations, I think is certainly appropriate. The one on the right, though, the blind stop on that window is as wide as the sash. And there's a lot of wood there. That's not a very good solution. Finally, there's full unit replacement, which is, gets you the best match, but only if you choose the window right. There are 4 new wood windows. They're all wood windows. And do all of them look like a historic window? I would venture to say not. And we won't out of time to spend more time. But here's again the building. These are all 3 in the same block, all exactly the same building. The historic window looking a little sad on the left, but you can see the simplicity of its brick mold blind stop sash. The one in the middle, it's a modern brick mold. It doesn't match the shape of the historic brick mold, and it moves the whole window forward in the wall. The brick mold is now all the way out. You can see this shadow, this dark edge running down along the down along this historic window here. That's all gone, and this because it's all been pulled out. And the black one even worse. Not only is the brick mold out, but the window is recessed even less from the brick mold, so it's a very flat brick mold. The whole window has been pulled forward in the wall system. So we've sort of changed the relationship of the window to the wall, changed the shape of the brick mold. These are rough opening units, but they were not well chosen and not appropriately installed. If you have a wooden window, the brick mold, despite the shape of the window, the blind stop may be different models, but the brick mold, no matter what window you get, if it's a wooden window, you can change the brick mold. It's just a piece of wood. You can buy it at the lumber yard. So without the brick mold, where the yellow circle is, you could put anything, casing, and certainly on a wood frame building, the wood window becomes even more important because you really the casing needs to be custom for the building. It's not as standardized the way brick molds would be. If you use a clad window, though, you have a whole different problem, because the clad window, if you look at what's in this yellow circle, that's a piece of the frame. You can't take that off. That's where the brick mold needs to be. So that becomes unavoidably a part of your brick mold or your casing, whichever the window is going to require. And you can see here on the left, the yellow, that's a part of the frame of the window. So we're stuck with that. So clad companies make means to snap something into that to actually create a brick mold. The red piece is a 3-dimensional piece. The drawing above, it's just a flat piece. And that's what was in the window, in the picture in the center. That was what was done. We have a snap-in piece that created a brick mold. If you have a particular brick mold you need to match in a general shape even, you need to shop around for the window companies. The brick mold shown in the right-hand corner down here, that's from a major manufacturer. And it's a shape that's very typical of a brick mold. But that brick mold usually is about 1.25 inches. That's a 3.5-inch piece of extrusion. So if they don't get the size right, the shape doesn't matter. But a clad window, you're better off not trying to stick a wood brick mold on it because you want a consistent finish. The window we don't want one piece that's painted that's going to peel and something else that's vinyl or that's aluminum and it's going to stay the same material. You can get a good solution with these, but you need to pay attention, and every window doesn't offer the solution for your particular building. An aluminum window, the aluminum window is just the window itself is the picture on the left. There's no brick mold, there's no blind stop, there's no nothing. All that is adaptable, is changeable based on an extrusion which can be made custom for a project if it's big enough. So an aluminum window, as shown in the sample there, can actually have very good clean lines by choosing the panning and applying it properly to the window. A lot of times there are a lot of choices out there companies have made for other projects. You may find something that's possible, but all this, the built-in element of that clad window that we have to work around doesn't exist on the aluminum window, and the aluminum window offers other options. So finally, just to and with this point, which I think is a really good illustration, if you step back and look at it, these two windows don't look that different. The historic window on the right and the replacement on the left. It's nice when people do these things right next to each other. It makes for better illustrations from my perspective. But when you look more closely, like in the insets there, you can see that the kind of simple steps in the shadow there line of the profile of the historic window are very much more basic than the cascading steps of the window on the left. Now, is that something that beyond the scope of what we need to fuss about? It might be in most cases. If that window was on the third floor, I don't think we'd even think twice about it, because it captures the overall, the meeting rails are pretty decent size. The Muntin grid looks like it has some three-dimensionality to it. It depends on the context. It depends on what was there to start with. Like the window on the right doesn't look like it even needed to be replaced. And if it didn't need to be replaced, one of the best ways to ensure that it doesn't get replaced is for us to insist that it has to be a perfect match, and then we'll be surprised how many windows we see repaired. And that's just one lever that could be used be aware that might be applied to your project if you're trying to replace a window that really doesn't need to be replaced. We are pretty reasonable about the threshold for replacement, that we're not going to hold your feet to the fire if it's a reasonable amount of deterioration. But I think there's a lot of room for judgment here, you can't expect one solution to be a one-size-fits-all for every project we're going to do. We need to look at these individually, and that's where the state's expertise and our time both come together to help to get to a solution that protects the integrity of the building. Thank you all for your patience and for listening to me ramble on here for so long. I think there's still a few minutes for some questions, right?
Yeah, John, we do have a couple of questions that have come in. Thank you very much. So the first question, we go back to the rafters. Beth asks, how would you evaluate insertion of insulation in the attic between roof rafters and drywall over it? Would it be acceptable to completely cover the rafters, or would it be acceptable to insert drywall between the rafters, leaving them exposed?
Well, I think we have to look at if it's an attic, as the picture was shown there, where there it did not look like it was truly occupied space historically. It had a bare brick wall and an unfinished floor. I don't think we would even ask you to put drywall over it. Why would you bother to put drywall over it if it's an attic? If you're going to make it occupiable space, I don't think, if you put no insulation between the rafters, would we care that you put drywall in an attic that was not finished? An attic is the attic and the basement are the bottom of the hierarchy. These are spaces that can be changed dramatically with very little effect on the character of a property. So I'm not sure I understand why we're asking the question about the drywall. The insulation and the drywall are really two different things. Insulation is a matter of technical effect, whether it's going to be good or bad for the building. The drywall is like, can you finish an unfinished space? Well, absolutely, if it's a space of no importance.
Okay, and Beth, if you want to qualify, put another question in. Frank asks, both Paint in America and A Century of Color include swatches with paint colors that I think a lot of people would consider nasty. But if you can demonstrate that that color was available, would that color be allowed?
I think the point is, do we have a building where the color was an integral part of the architectural concept at the time the building was built, like the school that I talked about? Somebody thought about, the architect would not have like left the building and said, well, the painter can paint what he wants. It was something that was thought about. So then we don't care what the paint chips say from the past. We need to protect what is there now unless we have evidence that it was different, and that evidence can be found in by doing a paint analysis or something. The colors that were used in the past that were available can make a lot. We can have a lot of discussion about those and how they were used and where they were used. But if we look at historic images, we do not see super high contrast. Even though we're looking at black and white images, we're not seeing like the sharp contrast. If the samples we see in the color from historic paint cards. Generally, some of the most brilliant colors were in the colonial times, and they were in interiors. They were not exterior paints in colonial buildings. They were paints in rooms. They were paints on the plaster and on the woodwork. In the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, the paint colors, there were certainly a lot of colors, but I would say that without evidence of making something pop, without physical evidence from the building or some evidence from historic images, that we don't want things that were extraordinarily aggressive, because I have found very little evidence of that from looking at historic images. So the fact that a color was available didn't mean it was being painted like that orange Queen Anne house that I showed.
Okay. Another question from Brian. Modern wood sash window mullions are typically much larger than ones made from old growth timbers. Is that a problem in your review?
Well, the only part of the window that is typically smaller historically is the meeting rail. The mullion is the structural element between them, and that the width of the mullion was usually determined by the space needed to put the weights, because the vertical weights were moved up and down in the mullion between the two different sashes. And so that determines why those were wide. They were hollow. What is different now, and it's not so much because the wood is different, it's because, one, early windows were not engineered. Nobody tested them for wind loads or how much they leaked. So the meeting rail was often inadequate for what they were. I have a picture I used to use in one of these presentations where the window was so wide, there was early on a tie rod run from the top of the sash down to the meeting rail to keep it from sagging. And the fact that somebody built something that was not really serviceable from the beginning doesn't mean we'd ask somebody to reproduce that. And I think we've been very generous about letting meeting rails get a little bit deeper in order to facilitate the demands placed on windows today for wind resistance and lack of and resistance to infiltration. If the window moves too much, we're going to get air leaking in. And then to top it off, if we're using a new window and putting insulated glass in it, we've doubled the weight. So we need more substantial material to hold that. But we don't necessarily, it does not automatic. Like some windows have much beefier sections than others, because a lot of these manufacturers make a window that will wind load test for a 4 by 8 foot size. Well, the average window in our house is not that big. So depending on where we're using it, we don't need a window that's designed for a 4 by 8 foot opening. So other companies may make something else. Pella, for instance, makes windows that have such narrow sight lines that they're almost incompatibly narrow for some windows. So there's no perfect window for all this. You can get pretty narrow meeting rails, but you may also end up getting narrower rails and styles than what you wanted. I think that's probably what you're asking about, not the mullion, but because the mullion is usually not structural. It's usually just to house the weight pockets.
Okay, as we wait for some more questions come on, don't be shy. Please write your questions in. I'll give a little commercial.
No, that's fine.
Plant Moran is the sponsor for our happy hour tonight at 5 o'clock. It's going to be a preservation hackathon. It'll be a lot of fun if you can join us. I have another question that's come in, so let me read this one. How would you advise an architecture board on the review of a request to replace residential windows, non-tax credit project? The house is Greek Revival, 1835. House moved twice in 1909 and 1983. Historic windows, 6/6, were put in I don't know if they were historic, if they were put in 1983. They are in fair to good condition. The new owner wants to put in new aluminum clad 1/1 windows. The house had 1/1 when moved in 1983. The current windows, 6/6, were taken from a historic house close to the original build period of 1830s, are in fair to good condition.
Well, I think it's a pretty complicated issue, what you've described there. And I can't suggest how a local review commission does things. I live in the city of Washington, D.C., where we have more buildings designated for local design review than any other city in the country, including things like places like New York and Boston, simply because they threw a very wide net. But the result is that they don't say no to much. They don't ever say no to replacing a window, and most of the worst window examples I take are ones taken from our historic districts where that's what they've done. So I think sometimes local commissions have to decide what they can politically restrict and still continue to function. It doesn't do any good to hold the bar too high if your community is not prepared to do that. But if you have a frame building, I would say adding a clad window becomes a very difficult issue because the way the trim works that I was trying to explain in some of those earlier images, it's very hard to get a casing to work with the frame of the clad window in a way that's not going to create awkwardness and incompatibility. And maybe your Greek Revival building is brick, but usually it's a wood building that gets moved that easily that often. So if it was a Greek Revival building, unless the windows, the 1/1 windows would be shown to be in the period of significance, I would say that a 1/1 window is very incompatible with the building of that period. We know that they were not using nobody was using 1/1 windows in the early 1800s. So I would think it would not be inappropriate to let them replace a window if the window is not historic, but it would not be appropriate to let them replace it with 1/1s if the style of the building is truly Greek Revival and not just simple vernacular building. And also it may be very difficult for them to do a good match with the way the trim works for a clad window. So I think you have to, what a lot of commissions fail to do is ask how the window will be installed, because there's no architect. So they're getting a drawing. Are there old jambs in place? Are they going to take the jambs out? What are they going to do? These are all questions that take a little bit of technical understanding in order that you get what you think you're going to get.
Okay, we have a question. If we have a question we would like your input on, should we request the discussion with you through our SHPO?
Well, if it's a project that's going to be a tax project, then the state is your point of contact, and we have a policy online about preliminary reviews where you might have a single issue that early on in your project you want to know, well, am I going to be able to put an addition on this building or not, and you don't want to go forward with trying to draw plans or filling out an application. So there's a mechanism for going to the state and having a conversation with them, regardless of the rounds. At any point in time, you can go and have make that contact with them and ask for that discussion. They will come to us at their decision when they feel that they need our assistance to provide you with good advice. That's their choice. If you just have a technical question about something that has nothing to do with a tax project, I answer my telephone, but that's another matter.
I'm sorry, I was asking about this next question. How intricate of a use of FIPON have you seen approved on building exterior? Simple flat molding only? More intricate three-dimensional work to replicate an elaborate window hood?
Well, the beauty of fiberglass, the fiber reinforced polymer, which is I think what you're talking about, is that it can do extremely complicated things. It's best when it's not where you're going to be bumping into it. It's not always super durable. For simpler things, more likely, if you really need to use a substitute material, expanded PVC, things that under the brand name of AZEK and its competitors, can be cut like wood and molded, and you can make things out of it that you would make out of wood. The FIPON is probably, because it's cast, it can be made for things that might have been stone, that could subsequently have been painted, and you don't need the stone texture, or sheet metal, where it was formed in an entirely different way. It wasn't cut with chisels or planes or something. If the shape that you're trying to make was cut with a chisel or a plane, then it can be made out of one of the expanded PVC materials, and those are all paintable. So in the end, whether they're wood or expanded PVC isn't going to matter a lot unless you fail to take into account the way each of these materials moves and behaves differently. Some expand and contract with wood, or some like wood expand and contract with temperature and moisture, but mostly with moisture. expanded PVC doesn't move at all with moisture, but expands and contracts a lot with temperature. Cement board, less with moisture, more with temperature, but not to the extent of PVC. So each of these materials, you need to understand the material and how you're going to use it successfully. Substitutes have great opportunity for situations where the historic materials have failed over time, and we really can't get the quality of the material if it was wood that we could get now, or the cost of making having a sheet metal worker reproduce something in a place where once it's painted, you won't know that it's not metal, but that it's fiberglass. All those are things that we can take into account and find excellent opportunities in the substitute materials, but we can't use them willy-nilly. We really need to understand how they behave and why are we using them. Because most of these things, they're only acceptable when they're painted. None of these things you want to be looking at the PVC finish or the fiberglass. They will mostly need to have a finish coat on them of some sort, and that's what really determines what we see. And the shape can be with fiberglass can be quite complex. It can be executed with a great deal of complexity, as it can with GFRC. All these things, it's kind of a generalized question, and I've talked about substitutes before in previous programs. I think that a lot of local commissions are very opposed to substitutes, but I think a lot of times it's because people are asking for the wrong reasons. They're looking for lower maintenance, which I can understand, and some of these materials can give you, or they're looking for less expense, and ones that are successful are usually not as cheap as you'd think they would be, and sometimes it's a time factor that getting something made in the more traditional way may take longer than your project can allow. So there are all a lot of factors that I don't think it's a yes or no to any of these kinds of things, and we have seen substitute materials used successfully, nearly all of them in some applications or another, and it just depends on where they're trying to use them and what they're trying to do. Sorry if that's not more specific.
The next question is, what is your opinion of the changing the character of National Historic District when the leadership of the district is trying to make the area seem more contemporary, similar to what you showed in Over the Rhine?
Well, that's a local issue for a local board to decide, and those are community-driven decisions, and I don't think it's my opinion really has any place in that argument. There is a point where a district can lose its integrity enough that someone might choose to ask it to be delisted, but that would have to be pretty far gone, and I don't see Over the Rhine getting anywhere near to being delisted. And there are people that argue for more contemporary expression and less like recreation of historic elements where they didn't exist, and making buildings looking like they've been there since the 19th century when they were built last year. And then there's another group that argues as vociferously that everything needs to look like it was all built in the 19th century. So there are passions on both sides of that question. But I don't think it's a clear-cut case, and as long as we can tell that which is historic from that which is not, and we have in many cases, if we're building buildings on empty lots, are we really worse off to have would we be better off to continue to have the empty lots where often case buildings have been lost than to have a building that might be a little more contemporary? I think we need to ask ourselves those questions before we decide, we just don't like what they're building.
All right, another question. I'm sure over time you see trends of issues that you've had to deal with. Besides more black window requests, what other trends are you seeing, and how should we address them with our clients?
Well, some things seem to come and go. We've seemed to come to a general acceptance of the level for accepting solar, though I see in a lot of local commissions that a willingness to accept solar everywhere, even on the front plane of prominent sloped roofs. And that, I don't see that the federal tax program is going to go there anytime soon, but the energy people could decide that their decision's going to supersede ours at any point in time, and there are discussions going on at high levels about those kinds of things, about anything that has to do with energy, because energy is such an important concern, and probably justifiably in many cases, that I think we will see more pressure in the future about doing things for the sake of thermal performance. But right now, the data is just not there to support that we need to rip out every window to make it efficient, or that we need to, and if we do, that we can't match them adequately with what we put in. And in terms of other materials, I don't see any big issue. A lot of the substitutes that we see, they have limitations because of the way they look, and some of them have come and gone. Some of them we have a track record on many of these. Some of the roofing products have been around, but there are plenty that aren't there anymore. So I think we have to be a little bit cautious about some of the new material, but when it's acceptable, then it can be a reasonable solution. And it doesn't make any sense to have somebody build something out of wood, because it was wood historically, and find that 5 years later it's rotted, because despite the carpenter's best efforts, which we rarely get their best efforts, the stuff was not treated in a way or assembled in a way that gave it potential longevity, and the material we're using just didn't have the potential of what the original stuff was. So I think trying to accommodate, just to be reasonable about things, is there's always a pressure for that. And if you have clients that are wanting to do something, then you just need to make the case. And the case is not in absolute terms. And when the tax projects, if you need a plate glass, if you have a project that's millions of dollars, and you need one window that's going to cost $10,000, like, well, then buy the $10,000 window. That's what the tax credits to support this. But if you have a $100,000 project and you need a window that's $10,000, then it's probably not reasonable within the scope of that project and the value of that building. So I think we do look at these in the context when making any of these decisions, and try to be reasonable about it. But in terms of trends, I do think that there is a certain fashion, like, you want colors are come and go in terms of what people like, and certain effects. We used to see a lot more pressure for decks than I currently see right now. Rooftops, the current trend is everybody wants a rooftop deck on any big building. They want a penthouse and a rooftop deck, someplace to get out on the roof and survey the city until the building next door gets taller. So that certainly is something that has only gotten worse in the 25 years since I've been at the Park Service.
Okay, I don't have any other questions, but I have some more announcements to go through. Again, if you want your AIA credits, you need to write office manager at heritageohio.org and include your AIA member number. We have from last night's happy hour, which was pitch party, we've got 3 applicants pitching. You can go to the Heritage Ohio website, heritageohio.org, and vote for one of those 3 projects. They were from Tiffin, Delaware, and Vermilion. Remember, all of our session recordings are available for you to hear on the event site if you need to review one of the sessions. We also have a resource room and vendor hall that you can see a lot of pre-recorded sessions and vendor information available there. I want to thank again the State Historic Preservation Office for being today's sponsor and the AIA credit sponsor. Thanks again to Jonathan Sandvik for his title conference sponsorship, and Steve Kuhn Restoration for his conference sponsorship. Thank you very much, and I hope to see a lot of you at our happy hour tonight at 5. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Joyce.